So you all asked the question, how can I trust a God who lets this pandemic happen? And I'm going to answer this by going a little bit more into my own personal experience, my own creative writing, my own wrestling with what God is doing and what's going on in the midst of this pandemic. And I hope it will give you some points of reference, maybe tension, resources for you to continue to talk in your own communities about this question. So to begin, I'll use the word scary. That's the word I kept using with my students in the early weeks when we were forced into isolation and online education due to the coronavirus. There was something forgiving about that word because of its childishness, I think. It's a word we associate with picture books about monsters in the dark, fears that are felt but aren't necessarily real. And I actually felt a little foolish sometimes saying it, but I still kept using it. It was all I could think to say. Meanwhile, over the last couple months, our family has been taking long 4-mile walks around the countryside nearly every weekend. We live in Hopewell Township as well, and it's beautiful out here. We couldn't do this really any other time of year. We live in an area where the roads are narrow and really busy, but there's fewer cars, fewer people these days, and our daughter's in a wheelchair, so we're just pushing her all around the neighborhood. She loves exploring, and my husband and I have worked up our stamina in terms of like pushing her up those hills in the wheelchair. So a couple weeks ago for our anniversary, my husband and I decided to go for a more strenuous hike, just the two of us. We were able to leave our daughter with the nurse at home. And when we got to the hill we planned to hike, there were a handful of cars at the base. We donned our masks. We were encouraged to see other hikers doing the same. But as we got into the woods and the path narrowed, there was group after group of people like trooping past us, unmasked. For each person, each group of hikers, we were scurrying off the path into the woods, trying to give this birth of 6 feet. A few people thanked us. Most people said something like, "Good morning," but it stopped feeling good for us almost immediately. Out on the trail, the breeze was perfect. I mean, we had plenty of energy and strength for the journey, and yet it somehow felt like we had assumed an unnecessary risk, especially for our family. Our daughter is immunocompromised. And I was just seething inside. I thought what I was feeling was anger until the next morning I confided in my daughter's nurse. I told him my husband and I, could hardly enjoy ourselves on this hike, and he immediately responded with compassion and empathy. He said, "Oh, because you were afraid." And I felt myself immediately wanting to push back. Like if I was angry, I couldn't be afraid, I presumed. If I was angry, I'd wrest some control that I didn't have back from fear. I had somehow assumed that these two things couldn't coexist, that strength would somehow obliterate fear. But now I often wonder, how can I be so strong, yet also afraid? And I think many of us are wondering some of the same things, like how can my fear for something I can't see be so real? How can I protect the people I love when I don't really know how to do that? How can this country be so resourceful and resilient, and yet we're being torn apart by an invisible force? As adults, I think we tend to squash our fears with logic or brute strength before we even feel them. We either dismiss our fears outright or we resolve them in order to get on living. But with children, we adults sometimes do this wildly generous thing of making space for their fears. We certainly could, but we don't often belittle them. After all, once upon a time, we might think, oh, we were all children. So we scoop children up into our laps, right? And we ask them what's so scary. We listen to them. We help children feel safe when they know it is okay, even justified, to be afraid of the things you can't see. I think I finally get what I was doing by telling my students this was so scary in those early days. I wanted them to know that it's okay for adults or even future pastors to be scared of a global pandemic. I wanted my students to know that fear is real, but it doesn't have to consume them. But in making space for their fear, I realized I was also carving space for my own. As any parent can tell you, there's something paradoxically cathartic and healing about holding space for another's fears. And maybe we tend to do it with children's fears because we're bigger than them and we assume we've outgrown them. Maybe we think that adult fears are somehow too big for us to manage. So it's better if they stay hidden or they get whisked away. But what if the way of love these days involves asking one another what we're afraid of and really listening? Making space for one another's fears in order to live well together? What if the way of love involves scooping one another up as we do our children, creating soft, gentle places for each other to land so we might dwell in strength and freedom together? What if freedom is not being afraid or conquering fear, but being respondent, yielding, understanding, and generous about the fears of others? For me, repeating it somehow still helps. This is scary. And even when I didn't say it nearly so clearly myself, someone else, my daughter's nurse, saw through my anger to my fear. Someone else made space for my fear. And instead of it growing and multiplying, that fear landed. It seems vital that in these trying times we recognize that fear doesn't go away, but it often goes into hiding. Underneath anger, there is often also fear. I think that's what we're seeing in our country in spades. Where there is distrust, fear. Where there is grief, fear. Where there is despair, certainly fear. And ironically, as we bury, stifle, and stuff down that fear, we drive even more social distance between us than this virus ever could. We shut ourselves off from real relationship. We withhold ourselves from fear in hopes that we can prevent, dodge, or dismiss the pain. What if we're doing the same thing with God? Like, it may not be that God is so much distant or silent or disinterested or cruel as it is that we're holding back our anger, our grief, our despair, and especially our fear, and understandably, like, we're really busy solving our own problems, keeping the world going, or assuming that we can't be afraid and faithful at the same time, or that a strong God wouldn't want anything to do with our pain and our fear. Let the little children come unto me, and do not stop them, for it is to such as these as the kingdom of heaven belongs. And Jesus laid his hands on them and went on his way. What if we let God in on our biggest fears, even though we're afraid to do so? What if we held one another's fears as a radical practice of faith and love? What if, just as God moved toward creation in suffering on the cross, we let our pain, our fear, and our suffering be safe with God? Might we become paradoxically even more faithful? Do we not serve a strong yet soft God? Perhaps God is ministering to us even more in these days of brokenness, fear, and pain. Perhaps what we really need to do is let go so that God can scoop us up, obliterate that social distance, and remind us how beautiful and right it is when we let God love us just as we are. Be blessed, my friends. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk with you.